Hey everyone, Mrhappy here, and welcome to Mondays with Mrhappy, aka Mrhappy Mondays, the weekly Q&A show where you ask me questions and I answer them. Nothing really to say much here at the beginning, so just going to get right into the Q&A. Of course, before we get started, just want to thank our patrons, of course, as we do, even when I don't have a news announcement here at the start of the video. Of course, we have the I almost said rotating, the scrolling names, that's the word I was looking for, the scrolling names that come somewhere around here on the screen. And then, of course, we have the images for our patrons of darkness, Khuja Cross on Jenova and Kurenai Oni, who've both been awesome supporters over on Patreon. So thank you to everyone. No sob stories or even interesting stories really this week. Just a chill week. Now, what else is there to say? Let's get into the Q&A and see how many mentor questions I have to answer this week. All right, first question of the week. Hashtag Mr. Space Happy Space Mondays. It's not how normal hashtags work, but I got you. How you doing? I'm doing all right. You doing all right? I'm doing all right. I wanted to ask about raid composition. Always love talking about that. Our group's DPS has been low the entire raid tier. While substituting one or two people, DPS becomes noticeably better, even if their numbers are relatively the same. I've done some research and found everyone has Scholar and Dragoon. Did you think the rest of the DPS jobs matter? Should we try to take advantage of having every role for the raid buff? Well, ideally, yes. You do want to have one of every role, which means 3 jobs are technically overlaps. Now, you always have 2 tanks and 2 healers. So between the 4 DPS, you have 3 roles to cover. You have your melee DPS, you have your ranged physical, and you have your caster DPS. Then that final DPS is the one that can just be a toss-up between any of the 3. That's not mandatory to have it. It's just about a 1% increase, but an increase is an increase. So assuming the player skill is all roughly even, then it should make out to be better for the team overall. Now, did you think the rest of the DPS jobs matter? I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, but I will speak generally to raid composition. If a group's DPS is low an entire raid tier, swapping jobs is usually not the solution. Now, sometimes if you take equal skill on 2 different jobs and one is clearly better, then you will absolutely see an increase. If there's any sort of player skill hit from a player swapping to a job they aren't 100% familiar with, that's where you start to run into issues. And that is a big thing when it comes to mid-tier skill raid groups, because that player switching doesn't have the experience to fully master the job they wanted to play, so there's a higher odds of there being a skill fall off if they were to swap to another job. I'd say the big thing, even though you might think the numbers stay relatively the same, that odds are if the DPS is actually higher, it's because those substituted players are, and I hate to say it, unfortunately better than the players they were substituting. That's almost always going to be the situation. So while yes, there are certain things you can do to improve DPS in the forms of raid composition, playing better in practice are always going to be the better solution in the long run, because you're not always, if the group has low DPS now, it's not likely to change without players just going out of their way to improve. Question number 2, hashtag Mrhappy Mondays, this time with no spaces. Got here on view number 2, and you asked the question. Ooh, and you're the second question. You know, the stars are just aligning. I'm doing good. Hopefully you are doing good as well. Hello. And 2 questions you shall be asked. Okay. Question number 1, in your recent memory, what game has surprised you the most, whether with how good it was or how bad it was? That's tough, because the games I personally play are games I at least have a semi-decent interest in. And none of them really surprised me because I was already at least holding a moderate expectation. Honestly, the closest thing that comes to recent memory, that it wasn't really a bad game, it was just a game that didn't live up to its expectations, was Kingdom Hearts 3. You know, I could sit here and say all the things I really was disappointed about, but I'm not going to also sit here and argue that it was a bad game. So it kind of doesn't fit of how good or bad it was. It just was the game that didn't meet expectations, didn't even remotely come close to meeting expectations. And I would argue there were some bad design choices made in that game overall. Curious to see if Remind changes my mind. As for question number 2 here, what game series would you love to see revived? You know, I actually have an answer to this. Normally, I thought this would have been a harder one. Or what game would you have loved to have the Spyro and Crash treatment? Which, by the way, if you hadn't named those, I was going to reference them. You know what? This is gonna, for some people, you're not gonna know what the hell I'm talking about. Mystical Ninja starring Goemon and Goemon's Great Adventure. 2 games on the N64 that I know they've made more Goemon games that didn't get translated over to English that I'm not familiar with. But man, those are some great 3D action adventure games that I'd love to go back to. You know, those are some of my favorite speedruns, even when it comes to, you know, GDQs or even just, you know, casually enjoying a speedrun. If I wasn't gonna say Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, Man, it's because, the thing is, I just keep thinking of games like Spyro and Crash, platformers or 3D action adventure games. Banjo-Kazooie comes to mind. Gex is another one. All of those I'd love to see get a treatment. Yooka-Laylee, the first one that came out, not the side-scrolling Donkey Kong Country style one we just got. That almost got the itch going, but I guess the characters kind of just almost felt like they were acting as if they'd already earned the respect of the people watching. And they didn't really, it didn't really try to be as charming as some of the older games did back on the N64 era. So it was okay, but it didn't quite scratch the itch all the way. I'm going to say my first choice, though, is Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. Question number 3, hashtag Mrhappy Mondays. Hey, Haps, lurked for a while, but first time question. Well, welcome. I'm working on clearing the current Savage here, but it's taken about 3 weeks for me to do E2 and E3 Savage, 7.5 hours a week with my static, plus some extra time each week in the Party Finder. Not bad. How is it some people are able to clear the whole raid tier week 1 in basically 450 gear? About how many hours are those kinds of players putting in the first week to be able to clear that quickly? Well, keep in mind that a large part of clearing the first week, it's a mix of time investment, but there's also a large skill aspect that comes into that. You need to be a player that's able to make close to the maximum amount of efficiency out of the gear that you currently have, because that's the only way you're going to be able to properly overcome the DPS checks that come from week 1 progression. So with that, it's not so much about how many hours, because the world first group is usually less than 24 hours, which, seems somewhat reasonable. I mean, you just said you got through 2 and 3 and 7.5 hours a week, plus a few extra hours in the Party Finder, which equates to, you're 3/4 of the way there. And I'd say that that's a reasonable amount of time investment. So I'd say that the majority of the week 1 clears are probably looking at closer to 30 to 40 hours of progression. And those first few groups will get it done in like the 18 to 24 hour mark. And then, it filters in hour by hour. You'll see some additional clears that start coming in. But 30 to 40 hours and a high degree of skill in various aspects, being able to recognize mechanics, being able to do them consistently, being able to perform on the job that they are playing at a higher level. All of those things come into week 1 clears. Next one, love you, Mr. Haps. Stop. I really do get awkward when people say stuff like that, because I'm not gonna say I love you back, because I have someone I love in the other room. She's my queen, but I heavily appreciate you. I'll give you that. First time asker, well, welcome. I'm a dancer main, and while I love it, and it's fun to play, I wish we had more utility if we're going to hold down the lowest DPS spot. I'd love to see a raise finish added. Do you think that's likely or feasible, even if it were an 8-step combo with a long cooldown? With Red Mage being the lowest caster DPS, but holds down its party spot with a raise utility, it would be cool to also get raise as the lowest range DPS. So first of all, I'd like to remind you, Summoner does also have a raise, and Summoner and Red Mage are not actually that far apart numerically speaking. They're fairly comparable, and then Black Mage is this chasm between itself and the other two caster DPS. I say no. There's no reason for Dancer to have a raise. Our DPS contribution is really a raid DPS total contribution. It's something that plays a big factor on Dancer, and it goes up obviously the more skilled the group is, but it keeps it fairly level with the other 2 ranged physical DPS. So it's unfeasible. Also, I will say this: Final Fantasy XIV has a huge issue with raise already being too powerful of a utility. Now that being said, a lot of people abandoned Red Mage and Res Mage with this raid tier, and Black Mage's overwhelming power became a substitute to having that extra raise in the caster slot, or even bringing a second caster for raise. People didn't even do that. They'd rather just bring a second Black Mage. So we're seeing that while raises in 14 have and are still generally considered to be too powerful of a tool, because there's no restrictions on them, and a lot of the time a fight is still completely clearable with that outside of week 1, where it's usually a little bit more chaotic if you start having deaths. That priority being lowered is actually leading the argument that Red Mage and Summoner deserve more DPS, because the raise is no longer at least a feasible enough reason to keep their DPS lower, especially Red Mage, which people are generally not super happy with right now. Even if it can perform okay, it requires a very high degree of skill for it to even perform on a fraction of the level as Black Mage. So that leads to its own issues altogether. So no, I don't think Dancer needs more resurrection level utility. More likely just boosting their numbers a little bit, fixing up certain gameplay elements. I spoke about that a few months ago in a Dancer video I did, where I said that one of the big changes I'd like to see is Saber Dance extending the duration of all the current finished flourishes that you have, like your finishing moves. Because that way when you use it, it doesn't necessarily interrupt the rest of your rotation, and that decision making during your burst windows becomes a little bit more linear and easier for dancers to perform on a higher level more consistently. So no res. That's the big thing. No res for ranged DPS. We don't need any more reses in the game, and we don't need a reason for Dancer to hold down that lowest DPS spot. Let's make it about performance as a DPS and not just give them another utility. Next question, hashtag Mr. Happy Mondays. Hey, Haps, been watching your stuff for a while, but first time askers of all the tethers you can dream of. You better tell Sly that, because he's going to owe me a Dragoon tether sooner or later. Thank you. Back to the mentor system again. Okay, so that's one. I said at the beginning, how many? That's one. I know, beat a dead horse. Why not? I seem to have become this massive crusader against mentors in the last, month or so. It's just, it's like everyone keeps talking to me about mentors. I'm like, I'm going to keep talking about it then. But what would your opinion be of splitting up the mentor crown into individual roles? You have a tank mentor, a healer mentor, a ranged physical mentor, so on and so on. I think it'd be a pretty solid addition. I kind of touched on it last week. Yes, I think this is a good idea. I think people needing to qualify on an individual level is at least a somewhat good thing, but I also just believe people who want to help will help. That's the bottom line. And they don't necessarily need a title. You know, at this point, it's a matter of trying to find people who care and nailing them down to one specific thing. And if they aren't good at that thing, then you know that the crown was just kind of for show. But as much as I prefer people to have to label themselves and have to qualify on an individual level, I also just believe if you want to help someone, you don't need those things. Anyone who wants to use that for a good reason, you know, because then you have people going, oh, we should have different crowns. We should have a tank crown and a healer crown. And it's like, leave the crowns out of it. We don't need the crowns. You either want to help people or you don't. And so while this would help, I hope that I just want the mentor system to be full of people who care. That's it. Oh boy, this one's a lot of text, but I'm going to take it anyway. Hashtag Mr. Happy Mondays. Greetings, your happiness. I have a question. My first indeed. So it's your first one. Now I don't feel so bad with how much text there is. Figured I'd ask after watching for years now. Oh boy. Here's that some of the content is most heavily used when rating leveling is done. The aesthetic parts of the game, glamour, chocobo glamour, seem to fall by the wayside in the development quite often. I understand the reasons given for having to do with network load, performance, or other spaghetti code excuses. By the way, not excuses, they are reasons, because coding is a very, very complex and complicated thing when considering how every item interacts with another item. On the other hand, I don't understand why they haven't improved. And not understanding is a key word here, because not understanding is the most fair way to put it. Because a lot of the times we actually straight up don't understand because we don't have the code. We don't see the code. We only see the end result. One, UI implementation of housing decoration layout requiring clippy, hacky solutions for item placement. So they've actually commented on that one in particular. Now, it is one thing to have a bug that allows players to clip items between each other. They've acknowledged saying they have no intention of getting rid of that because they don't have a solution on their end. It's a much different thing to deliberately code something to be clippy and hacky like that than it is to just allow it to exist in its current form. So that they won't improve probably until they have a technical solution that allows people to do these silly, silly things that you can do by clipping furnitures into one another. 2, additional button bars and additional button customization. I'm not sure what you mean by that. I find that Final Fantasy XIV's hotbar and hotbar customization is about 95% there in regards to all you should really need it for. The only thing is that I wish I could set different keybinds to different HUD layouts. So you know how we have HUD layouts 1, 2, 3, 4. You could say 4 different ones. I'd love to also be able to save keybind designations to each of those HUD layouts, because the only reason I'd personally ever want different HUD layouts is for different roles: healers, DPS, tanks. And so having 3 different ones with 3 different keybind layouts, so that way I don't have to worry about just trying to fit in keybinds to what I'm using for other jobs and just trying to make it work for everything. That would be my one big improvement. That's why it's 95%, and that last 5% goes to that. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by it, because I don't agree entirely with the assessment, unless we're on the same page about that same 5%. And 3, retainer character inventory management. This I find is mostly on me, so I don't know all the way. They've specifically commented on not being able to just freely look through all the retainers because of the way retainer information is gathered whenever you actually want to access it. Basically, retainers are not loaded and are not constantly tracking the data that is involved with them until you summon one individually, in which case it loads all the data at once. And they do that so that way the servers aren't constantly overloaded with people having 2, 3, 4, 8 retainers, all filled with tons of items and tons of code in something like a city-state crashing in. However, I find inventory management's mostly on me. If it's all screwed up, it's because I've screwed it up. I found a system that works mostly for me, but it still looks a little bit like a mess. So again, I'm not 100% sure what specific aspects you're referring to because you're not elaborating on them. Those 3 items alone are a major pain point for large segments of the community. Again, I found a large segment of us are hoarders, and that's why it's a pain point for that last one. But that's you just asked for my thoughts on those things, and I guess that's the closest that I'm going to get to an actual answer, because there wasn't a question. Unfortunately, it was just these things are pain points, and what do you think? So I'm not sure how much more to elaborate without more. I guess more of an example. So maybe in a future week, if you can follow up on that, I can answer it more directly. Next one, hashtag Mr. Happy Monday, simple-ish glam question. Hello to you too, by the way. Do you have a favorite glam piece or glam plate? Have you seen the toad head? That is on every single job I play. That's my winner. Next one, hey there, Mr. Happy. Hello. While we're still fresh on this new expansion, I'd like to hear your opinion on the future of 14. Would you like to see Square Enix continue with increasing the level cap, or try something else such as Guild Wars 2 that went with Mastery System, or World of Warcraft that's thinking of doing a level squish? Also, before we get Producer Live Letter Part 2, what are your predictions, hopes for what will be with Desynthesis? Thanks for your hard work with all the streams and videos. Thank you. Some very simple questions. I think increasing the level cap is fine. However, World of Warcraft has found the one downside to that, and that eventually people just feel overwhelmed with being told you need to do 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120 levels. That's why they're doing it, and I think it actually makes a lot of sense for them to be talking about doing something like that. When numbers get out of control, sometimes you got to go back to the drawing board and redesign how everything's done to some degree. Now, I think we're many, many years from seeing something like that needing to be possible in Final Fantasy XIV, but I think it is an inevitability. Final Fantasy XIV is even trying to get ahead of the item level problem, of item level constantly going up. With the next expansion, we already know in 6.0, they're planning a stat squish, which is where basically they take all the stats in our game, they lower the values, but change the scaling on them at the same time. They change the scaling for the rest of the game and all the content there. And it makes it so that the numbers don't go into the millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions. So you don't get like Diablo 3-esque numbers. As for Guild Wars 2 Mastery, I don't want anything to do with Guild Wars 2's progression system. So no. I'm sorry. I like Guild Wars 2 for exploring around and some of the environments and some of the story sets, but the Mastery system, outside of like completing map objectives and stuff like that, it did nothing for me in regards to making me feel like my time was being well spent on advancing my character to its next stage. So I definitely don't want to copy Guild Wars 2 when it comes to anything progression related, because I don't agree with any of the decisions that game has ever made in regards to progression. Oh, I almost forgot to answer. Predictions, hopes for Desynthesis? Listen, they've already put the nail in the coffin on that one. The only hope I have is that you at least need to have the crafter leveled to the same level as the item that you're trying to desynthesize. So if it's a level 80 item, they need to have a level 80 version of that crafter. Same as repairing, you need 10 levels lower. So I guess the same as melding in a sense, which you need to be the same level as the item or higher. So that's my only hope, because that will at least keep that market somewhat active or somewhat valuable, especially when crafting materials for new items are still low in supply, especially at the beginning of expansions. I made tens of millions off the beginning of this expansion. Maybe do a better job of educating people that it exists, and worry less about this like individual level or the desynthesis level. Just at least have some requirement for it, and then educate people that it exists a little bit better. Next one, hashtag Mr. Happy Mondays. Hey there, Happy. Hello. I recently cleared Titan Savage as a Black Mage. Congratulations, which I used the entire tier. Now my static is looking to try and jump into Ultimate as 5.1 hits. However, I'm feeling a bit doubtful about continuing to do it with Black Mage, as the prospect of extreme amounts of movement seemed very daunting. So I was considering swapping over to a different class for that. My question to you basically is, what can I expect from an Ultimate fight? Will it really get to a point where Black Mage becomes extremely difficult to play? Would it be the right choice to swap to something else if I don't consider myself an exceptional Black Mage? If you do not consider yourself an exceptional Black Mage, you have two choices. You can get better at it, which is the inevitability when you want to play a job, especially in something that is Ultimate level. You need to be an exceptional player to do Ultimate at any reasonable pace. So if you're not an exceptional Black Mage, but you're not exceptional at your other options either, then swapping to another job is not going to do you any good. At the very least, maybe going Red Mage or Summoner to progress early in the fight. But if you're not exceptional on those either, and you're still trying to fit within the caster role, is my assumption, then this doesn't really serve you any purpose. Black Mage is not an immobile mage, as many people have been led to believe at this point. They've got so many movement tools. It's just about learning the fights and learning where to place yourself. That does suck when you're doing a brand new fight, and on Ultimate, it is harder to do than it is on Savage encounters. But once you've mastered it, Black Mage is still the god that it always has been. So this is really on you. I cannot make this decision for you. I do not know what your skill level, what you consider exceptional, and what your skill level is on the jobs that you're considering as an alternative. So weigh how good you are in the other jobs. If you don't think you're any better at those jobs than Black Mage, then you probably just want to stick to Black Mage and learn it there and become exceptional, as opposed to just throwing in the towel because you told yourself you're not exceptional, because that'll keep you from ever being the Black Mage you want to be. So my vote is stay Black Mage, but weigh the things that I've said and make the decision for yourself. Hashtag Mr. Happy Mondays. Hey there, Haps. Hello. Fairly recent viewer, but I quite enjoy your videos. Thank you. One thing that's been on my mind recently was wondering about differences in the community for the game between continents. Feels like the Japanese player base has a pretty different approach to a lot of content, and Square Enix might be listening more to that than the rest. I even feel like there are differences between US and EU communities. Maybe not something you can answer directly, but it might be a good topic for the podcast. Okay, so that wasn't a question. But I'm going to infer a question from that, and that is, what is your thoughts and stances on the various different communities? Of course, different communities are different in different parts of the world. You know, we're all raised with different values and with different cultures and whatnot, whether you're what's considered the melting pot of the United States, or you're a continent filled with multiple different countries, all of which have their own cultures in Europe, or you're part of the Japanese culture. They're all very, very different from one another. And so, yes, what you said is accurate, but I'm not I guess now that I'm reading it, I guess I'm not exactly sure if I can infer a question, because you're not asking how, you're just acknowledging that they are. So I don't know, I guess, what to say, because there's no question here. So consider this a lesson for the future for anyone watching. Saying things and, stating them with the hashtag Mr. Happy Mondays, you got me to pay attention to it, but without a question, it's kind of just like, I kind of just linger like this. So I did the best I could to kind of reiterate, I guess, the question in a more eloquent way, but I don't have anything to add to it because there's no inferred question here. So I'm going to move on to the next one, and we're going to take this lesson and apply it to future weekly Q&As. All right, next one, question for next week. Hello to you too, by the way. As a new player who wants to achieve, I'm really struggling to gear my main jobs, plural. Been active since August, and my mains all have item level 450 pentamodal crafted gear. I'm assuming you meant crafted gear, because you wouldn't wear crafter gear on them, and a few 460 and 470 pieces. With savage weekly gear lockouts, my crappy dice, I find myself often ending a weekly lockout empty-handed. Besides tomes, potions, and food, is there anything I can do week over week to increase my character strength or average item level above 450? So, when it comes to, as you've already said, weekly tombstone caps, as well as occasionally rolling a dice in savage, those are your only options in an even-numbered patch. Since you've already hit the minimum of needing the crafted gear at 450, everything else will be tomes and upgrade materials in savage. And that stuff is exclusively through tombstones and raiding during an even-numbered patch. Luckily for you, odd-numbered patches coming up offer a much wider array of ways to improve your item level. Upgrade materials that you were previously obtaining exclusively from Savage for the even-numbered patch, you'll be able to get those through Hunt Nuts, which I hate to say, but that's what they are, those clan Nutsy marks. And you'll also be able to obtain them from the weekly 24-man token that we'll probably be getting from the Nier Automata first tier raid. So that'll allow you to take those 460 items, upgrade them to 470. Speaking of the 24-man raid, it will also have most likely item level 460 armor dropped directly. That's another way you could achieve a few upgrades. Also, the new Extreme Trial, which is the final boss of Shadowbringers, but on the extreme difficulty, will likely be dropping item level 465 weapon. So if you're still in need of a weapon upgrade as well, he's another option. And then as patches go on, as even-numbered patches and odd-numbered patches roll around, this will kind of just be how it works. You'll do an even-numbered patch that's just like this one, with an odd-numbered patch falls that allows you to catch up on item level a little bit. Then even, then odd, the new expansion, and we'll be good to go. So if you're having issues with it now, wait a couple more weeks, and with 5.1 just around the corner, you'll have a few more options. And apparently, much to my surprise, the remaining comments are all comments about last week's episode. So that was actually the last question that we're going to have. There was one more that I saw, again, it was more of a passive comment, so I left a little comment just under it. But that's going to be a wrap for this week's episode of Mondays with Mr. Happy. Now, I didn't say anything at the start of the video, but this week I'm putting the nose to the grindstone. I'm going to be getting a few videos out, even if they are what I would consider relatively amateur-ish compared to some of the other things that I've made in the past. I at least want to get the wheels spinning up here and getting some content out to you guys. Some content that is very, very late, but I'd like to get it done all the same. So be on the lookout for some very basic things popping up this week. I promise there will be some, as well as, of course, any news. We'll, of course, have a live letter overview and thoughts about various things that come from that. And, yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it. But thank you, everyone, for watching this week's episode of Mondays with Mr. Happy. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And if you have a question for next week's episode, be sure to put it in the comment section of the video below. Now, I'm going to go let my cat in because he's scratching at the door, and I will see all of you for the next episode of Mondays with Mr. Happy. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And until then, take care.